US Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump have held their only planned debate of this year's presidential campaign.
Harris und Trump.
Donald Trump et Kamala Harris.
Beyond the obvious impact that the election has had on the United States itself, it is undeniable that it is also an international spectacle. The truth is, what happens in the United States doesn't stay in the United States. But especially here in Germany, they didn't just watch. They analyzed, scrutinized, and dissected the candidates on a level that is both impressive and mystifying. But now that the outcome has been decided, there still remains one question that comes up again and again. How? Germany, like most Western European countries, models their society as a social democracy, with a social market economy forming the foundation of everyday life. Strong unions, government-supported pension systems, universal public health care, free university and trade school tuition, small religion, and big social safety nets. All things that, to Germans, are incredibly important for a healthy society. Yet, all things that Trump stands in staunch opposition to. So today's video is part of a series that I'm calling Americans Explained. And I'm going to start off this series answering a question that seemed to be quite pervasive. Why is it that Americans vote seemingly against their own self-interest? Well, let's take a look. Now, first and foremost, this question is problematic at best. It presumes that I know better than you what your own self-interest should be. However, this is still a question that comes up again and again, and it actually isn't one that Europeans ask of Americans, but in fact one that Americans ask of each other. Working-class Americans who vote for Trump continue to approve of him as president, even though he supports healthcare bills and business regulations that would disproportionately hurt them. And highly educated, high-earning professionals tend to lean Democratic, even though Republican tax policies would probably leave them with more money in their pockets. The thing is, whether you're right or left, especially if you consider yourself a civically engaged person, you probably look at the other side with a healthy amount of confusion. And many Americans have this sense that our two major political parties are drifting further and further away from center. And rightfully so. In fact, the partisan gulf today between the right and the left is larger than it has ever been. But the first thing to understand about Americans is that when it comes to voting, self-interest has actually probably little to do with the individual self-interest anymore, and is much more tied up in the symbolic attitudes and partisan ideology. And there is a super fascinating study by psychologists at Cambridge University that put this exact theory to the test.
We have a special tax that here is going to do, I think, quite well.
The scientists tested whether support for Trump was diminished after voters filing their taxes in 2019 saw a lower than expected return. Interestingly, although they were more financially disadvantaged by his tax reform, their support for him didn't waver. Instead, participants who had previously ranked tax policy as highly important prior to filing simply downgraded their previous statements on the importance of lowering taxes, possibly in an effort to reduce dissonance and justify continued support for Trump. In other words, despite having their biases and financial self-interest confronted, voters simply rationalized the outcome in order to continue their partisan worldview. And I don't mean to pick on Republicans here, because the truth is there are plenty of studies that show the same thing happens with Democrats as well. As much as I think all of us would like to believe that we are free-thinking, independent voters, well, data actually says otherwise. We tend to vote almost unwaveringly for a single party that flashes the virtue signaling symbols that we socially align with. And as partisanship has grown steadily in the United States, switching parties is actually really rare. So has ticket splitting, by the way, which is where voters support different parties in presidential and down-ballot races. So while yes, we do have this big chunk of the population that says they're independent, in reality, most of them are lying, at least to themselves anyway. American voters consistently lean towards one party or the other. So yeah, I think Americans do live in a state of denial about how truly partisan they really are. Because, I mean, well, after all, admitting that you're partisan also means admitting that you're biased, which is something not all of us like to admit. And speaking of bias, it begs the question, how do you confront your own biases and unlock international content to give you a wider range of viewpoints? Well, speaking personally, one of the tools that I use is a VPN, specifically a VPN from Surfshark, who's the sponsor of today's video. If you don't know what a VPN is, it stands for Virtual Private Network, and it encrypts all of the data sent between your computer and the internet, so no one can steal your personal information. But a VPN can be used for so much more than just security. It can also help you access online media content like news reports and articles that aren't available in your area by changing the virtual location of your computer, which is a very handy tool that I personally use when I'm doing the research for videos just like this one. Had it not been for my VPN, I wouldn't have been able to unlock US government websites and certain local news reports, which are normally blocked from computers with an EU IP address. So if you don't already have a VPN, I highly recommend checking out Surfshark. So secure your privacy with Surfshark today. Enter coupon code TYPEASHTON for 4 months extra at surfshark.com/typeashton. Plus, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk to try it out. To get started, simply click the link down below in the description of this video. And that's the thing. Interestingly, unlike Dutch, French, Swiss, or German voters, for example, who are much, much more likely to vote for multiple different candidates that belong to different parties, Americans are much more tribal when it comes to their politics. As the journalist George Parker, now of The Atlantic, once summarized the problem, American politics today requires a word as primal as tribe to get at the blind allegiances and huge passions of partisan affiliation. Tribes demand loyalty, and in return, they confer the security of belonging. They're badges of identity, not of thought. And when you are part of that system that only has two tribes, it essentially boils down a lot of arguments to an us versus them mentality, where them are people who are morally suspect and us righteous saints by comparison. And since political tribalism is also about identities, it is deeply emotional. And this is why political arguments in the United States often degenerate into outrage and animosity. People feel like their identities are under attack when their politics are attacked. And while I would still say that there are people who are passionate here in Germany about politics, I don't know if I would personally categorize them as emotional. And I say that living in a place where people regularly glue their hands to the streets to protest climate change policies.
It's been a long time coming, but tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
I've been voting since the 2008 national election in the United States. And in my opinion, Americans have a visceral reaction to their political team winning or losing. It makes people cry. It makes people riot. And the thing is, there doesn't really have to be any policy content for people to get riled up and to be extremely committed. I mean, there's a legitimate cult-like behavior when it comes towards the absolute devotion that many people have towards their political party. But things didn't used to be this way.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president, you like I...
Back in the 1950s, our political parties were far more ideologically mixed than they are today. We used to have conservative and liberal wings of both camps. In fact, Eisenhower was courted by both Republicans and Democrats to run as their nominee. Eventually, he ran as a Republican, but he was still elected with an overwhelming support from the American people. And many political scientists and scholars believe that he probably would have won regardless of which party he would have ran under. But fast forward to the 1960s, and things started to change. We had the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and essentially these two things, by the Democrats, forced a major realignment within the parties, with many Black Americans becoming Democrats, and many white Americans who opposed this integration left that party. Fast forward to the 1980s, Americans saw the mobilization of the socially conservative Christian right, as well as business interests aligning with Republicans. And the advent of our media-centric society led to the rise of partisan talk radio, cable TV news, and the internet and social media, which essentially exacerbated the divide along partisan lines. And ultimately, what ended up happening is that our society changed to where the two parties were symbolically different. And those differences weren't necessarily due to policy changes. Rather, it almost was as if Democrats and Republicans looked different. They were different in the way in which the kind of religious services they attended, the kind of media they consumed. And so too, the label Republican or Democrat became a kind of way to identify yourself. And, well, your minivan, apparently. Belonging to one party or the other was a way to differentiate yourself from each other in a social way, not just in sort of a policy way. And this leads me to my third and final reason why I believe that Americans vote seemingly against their own self-interest. If we presume self-interest is interpreted in a distinctly Western European kind of way. And I think it kind of comes down to the fact that Americans ultimately have a hard time accepting that they might have something to learn. If you are a living, breathing, voter card-carrying American today, you have lived your entire life now with the United States being superior. And while I say that somewhat sarcastically, truthfully, whether you measure it in financial, cultural, social, or militaristic terms, the US has been on top of the global food chain, so to speak. We conquered the great frontier on Earth and in the heavens. We are the gold standard, whether you measure us in athletics or in science. And we didn't just invent freedom, we trademarked it. And yeah, this ages me. But, I was only 1.5 years old when the Soviet Union fell apart. And so pretty much my entire existence on this planet has been during a time in which the US was the only global superpower. And so too, perhaps unsurprisingly, Americans believe with all sincerity that they live in the greatest nation on earth, full stop. But the reason why American exceptionalism is so pervasive isn't just because we believe that we are great, but that we also did it by ourselves. I think it's really interesting that even on a national level, we do try to reinforce this idea that we are a self-made man, a self-made nation, and that these two things together, that we're so successful because we did it all by ourselves, well, together those things reinforce a political point of view that is inherently, I think, disjointed from the way in which many Western European people see politics and the role of government and, well, ultimately the hallmarks of what they consider a healthy society to be. And again, fully recognizing that Europe is not a monolith, there are still certain things that I think most of us would agree that the majority of European nations do subscribe to. Universal access to affordable, government-regulated healthcare, low to no-cost higher education, worker protections for things like maternity, paternity leave, and support of trade unions to protect jobs, unemployment insurance, and greater regulatory powers on behalf of the government, whether that means protecting the environment or the consumer from predatory financial schemes. And these are things that, again, are generally seen as in everyone's best self-interest, but are also things that typically require a larger government. They're also things that to most Americans are seen as something that it's not really the government's job to provide or protect. It's not really a public service. It gets antagonistically called different things: the nanny state, a welfare state. But the general consensus is that a social market economy will lead you to socialism.
Socialism. Socialism. Socialism. Socialism. Radical socialism and the destruction of the American dream.
And that undermines everything that a hardworking, self-reliant man believes in. Again, we didn't become great because we asked for handouts. We became great because we worked for it.
This is America, Lois. Men have always run things, and there have never been any problems whatsoever.
And I think that's the biggest reason why, specifically low-income white Americans, vote Republican, despite the GOP's tendencies to cut down on welfare, lower the taxes for the wealthy, and overall favor the interest of corporations and their shareholders than the average Joe. You know, I personally don't subscribe to the theory that there's some sort of moral conflict with the democratic social policies, to where people will vote in their financial self-interest over some of these more social issues, whether that be immigration.
Won't say it for little baby ears over there, but it rhymes with shmushmortion.
Or gay marriage, for example. I think it has something much, much more to do with what's called the meritocracy trap, which essentially is the idea that people's socioeconomic standing is due to their own merit. The people at the top deserve their success, and those at the bottom, their failure. The American dream, after all, was epitomized by hard-working, relatively economically stable workers, and those who accept welfare are seen as lazy, preferring to mooch off the state rather than working hard for apparently achievable financial mobility. A recent Center for American Progress study found that 60% of Republicans agreed with the statement, people get stuck in poverty primarily because they make bad decisions or lack the ambition to do better in life. Others, polled by the Pew Research Center in 2020, supported the idea that people are poor because, quote, they have not worked as hard as most other people, end quote. And this phenomenon transcends demographics like race. In exit polls from the 2024 election, those with the lowest income, often those on welfare or unable to work, supported Harris with the largest margin compared to Trump of all income brackets, perhaps due to their relatively positive attitudes towards welfare. But in comparison, those in the next two brackets, with earnings between $30,000 and $99,000, supported Trump by the larger margin. While both of these groups would likely benefit from various welfare programs, it seems that being moralized into the settled working class versus the hard-living working class has a significant impact on how positively people view welfare policies. And lest we not forget, Americans do live in a kind of bubble, both physically and psychologically. Although we do share two international borders, unless you live on a border state, you likely have little to no regular interaction with a foreign economy outside the swim-up bar at your English-speaking all-inclusive resort, which you probably still booked in US dollars. It's just really hard to comprehend how social market economies work unless you work and live within one for a substantial amount of time. Quite frankly, the benefits of a social democracy are still sort of this really amorphous, intangible thing unless you have personally benefited from it. And that insular worldview is reinforced by the fact that Americans don't consume a lot of media on foreign relations or international events. Despite having a 24-hour news cycle, we spend 23 of them talking about ourselves. And that matters. And you know, I led this story with the statement that I think most Americans would probably be surprised at how informed German people are on American politics. And that's because I think the average American person doesn't really pay all that close attention to international politics or elections. I doubt most people really hardly pay much attention to the Canadian election, let alone the German election, and that's all the way across the Atlantic. When you turn on the TV in Germany or open up a German newspaper, you see plenty of front-page headlines about what's happening in the United States. And that's actually one of the reasons why I started this channel in the first place. I wanted to create a platform where we could exchange different ideas and information on economic, social, and cultural differences that are worth learning from one another. And maybe that's a really good segue into me just reminding you that if you enjoyed what you saw today, I would sincerely appreciate it if you hit that thumbs up button. And if you want to get more content from my channel, type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!